Hi, everybody. David Noor. I want to welcome you back to another one of my favorite things that I do on LinkedIn Live, which is I call them In Conversations. And this is where I invite past or current executive clients, other thought leaders, people I just think highly of. And we have a casual conversation about some of their efforts, some of their initiatives, some of what they're seeing in the market. And the goal always is to turn that thought leadership into practical, pragmatic ideas that my senior executive clients, friends can put into good work. I'm elated to be joined by a longtime friend, Thinkers 50 community, Nilüfer Merchant. Hello there.
Hey, David.
It is good to see you. For our audience, we're live on Facebook and LinkedIn and YouTube and X. I would encourage you to jump in with questions, comments, your insights, ideas that you think would be relevant for the broader audience. Or if you have a specific question of Nilüfer, please also bring those up and we make sure we address each of them. So let me start by your background. So people who may not know about where you've been, what you've done, can you talk a little about your journey to date? And then I want to jump into the book.
Sure. 25 plus years of doing tech exec roles. So Apple, Autodesk, Go Live that got bought by Adobe, in a consulting role because I ran a strategy firm called Rubicon, worked with Nokia, Microsoft, Symantec, like everyone kind of thing, and got passed through word of mouth of here's your card and this person will help you. And then inadvertently fell into this sort of thought leadership role where in 2013, I got this award, and David, you were there. It was the person most likely to influence the future of management in both theory and practice, which was so lovely for me, not having gone to a name brand school and really coming at it from a practitioner's role. It's very unusual for someone like me to be on the list, and now 10 years later, still on the list. So that's kind of how I come to today.
Love it. And your most recent book, that's what we're going to talk a lot about, is this most recent book, Our Best Work, Break Free from the 24 Invisible Norms. There you go. There you go. That limit us. So give the audience a glimpse into, I've got a love-hate relationship with books. Right?
Yeah, all of us do. You have to do it. Yeah.
It is just could be an aggravating, like I guess anything else you do creative, aggravating process, and yet fulfilling when it's done, and you feel like your work and as people read it and give you comments, you feel like your work matters. I guess talk about what was the impetus for this, and then a little about the journey.
Sure. So the impetus was this, that anytime I've taught students or executive education programs, and I have them identify what is it that allows you to do your best work, and they just start, working as teams to come up with lists. It's always my gifts got used. We had the right, honest conversations. We were organized around shared goals, just all the things that you and I know in relational economics is actually driving the value creation process. Mm-hmm. And then I had this little epiphany that we actually don't know how to measure any of those things. We know how to measure the capital-based things like profit and productivity and efficiency and so on, but we do not know how to measure the value creation increments of, like, are we collaborating well? And if we are collaborating well, it means that we're doing more than the sum of our parts, which means that we're going to be able to create something useful. And yet we don't know how to measure that. We don't know how to understand it. And so I actually started from that angle with my co-founder, Tim Castell, and we were working down that pike, and I did not want to write a book. This is my fourth. And I was like, don't really need to do another one because why push the rock uphill? But what I realized was people do not understand how to unpack a relational construct. Partially because we're so sold the self-help sort of constructs of you should do it ourselves. And because relational stuff is at the intersection between you and I, and so is invisible, intangible, and so it's just hard to put our hands around. And but I realized that's why we actually needed to write a book, because we needed to help people see the invisible.
I often say I learn as much about my topics through that journey, and as I'm writing the book and as I have conversations. When you and I were having lunch, you talked about, I guess, connecting with Amy Edmondson. And
Yeah.
Amy had an aha moment. And I guess talk about, what did you learn in the process of researching and writing this? And have there been some aha moments for you in conversations about this topic with others?
Yeah. Okay. So let me tell you the Amy Edmondson story. So Tim and I were going into some round robin conversations to share our early thinking about intangible labs, the fact that we have these invisible things that are actually shaping our value creation process. And if we can't see it, we can't solve for it. Right. So that was basically our thesis. We had come up with 24, and then we were basically using this conversation to say, give us some feedback. What else can we be doing? Blah, blah, blah. You know, just that whole interactive process. And Amy happened to be sitting there like this and staring at the slide, just staring. And, you know, I presented at huge arenas, 10, 20,000 people. I've presented at the main TED stage, all these different things. So as a speaker, one of the things, you know, you get really good at knowing is who you have in the room and what they're focused on. And so it wasn't like I missed the fact that Amy was sitting there staring at my slides and intently, so much so that I was pretty sure she wasn't hearing a word I was saying. And she did it for like 20 minutes or something, like some really long period of time. And I was so self-conscious, but I didn't want to be like, hey, Amy, what's got your interest, right? So because there were other people in the room I was managing for. So we get to the dinner at the end of the day, and she comes, she shows up, she wasn't planning to. And she said, I just really want to take you aside and share something. And I'm expecting, just like, you know, every student who has ever faced a teacher, I'm expecting like, oh, I did something wrong, or I could do better, right? And I was expecting sort of the teacher moment of like, here's some feedback for you. And she said, I've been focused on psychological safety for 20 years now. And I've always been trying to figure out what are the emergent qualities and the things you need to be tracking in order to get to psychological safety. And the work that you're doing actually accomplishes that. And I was like, it does, because innovation and good design thinking and project management, all those things are emergent qualities. We do not get there by managing innovation. We get there by doing some preconditioned stuff. Just as we can't manage psychological safety, but we can do some preconditioned stuff. So it didn't surprise me afterwards, you know, after her comment, that I'm like, oh, of course we're looking in the same vein. And so we've identified 24 things that we think are both limiting us in terms of where our attention is, and then identifying what the replacement leading indicator needs to be and what we need to be putting our attention to in order for us to be able to go forward and actually create value.
For our audience, if you've just joined us, you're listening to Niloufar Merchant, Thinker's 50 Friend, her new book, Our Best Work. You can see it, break free from the 24 invisible norms that limit us. And what I appreciate in every conversation with Niloufar, the light bulbs go off of the intersections or the aha moments from my work on relationships, and obviously the insights that she brings. Of the 24 invisible norms, was there one that really stood out for you? Was there one that you either prioritized or you
That's like saying, do you have a favorite child? You can't do that to me.
Okay.
Actually, can I do it to you? Can I say what really struck you?
I got to tell you, the metaphor of the cage, right? That whole cage. Can you talk about that? Because I think it's so true for so many of us.
Yeah.
Talk about that cage concept.
So one of the things I was realizing, again, that whole, like, if I have a team, write down, here's what we really need to be doing, and it's all relational. Then if you say, okay, why aren't we doing it? Here's the two things that almost always, well, three things that get said. First, it's me. I must not be working hard enough. I must need a communication skill. I should probably learn how to interact with the leader better. Like, it's me. Something about me needs some help, and I can get better at this. Number two, it's them. My boss sucks. They just don't get it. Blah, 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 right? Option three, capitalism sucks. And we operate inside a system that is so terrible, it is not possible for people to do their best work because the system drives short-termism, yada, yada. those three answers. And I was really thinking, if it's a relational thing, then it's not you or me or even this big thing. It is us. And when I ever think about changing systems, and I've done a lot of systems change over the years, a ton of it. And one of the things I've realized is you don't fix a system itself, and you don't solve the problem at a micro individual level. What you do is you change the interaction layer. And as soon as you change the interaction layer, the system changes and the individuals change. So back when I was doing strategy work, I would be working at a firm like Adobe, running a team of like, let's fix this product. And after we were done, and all the way through it, by the way, people resisted every part of the process. And then we were done. Almost everyone on the team said, well, we did something amazing. What did we just do? And they had this curiosity about, oh, could we duplicate this? And more importantly, the teams who were watching adjacent to us were like, kind of like looking over, like we had a good lunch and sort of like, hey, how do I get me some of that? And that's how change actually happens. It isn't some edict. It's us having a success and then us saying, oh gosh, let's figure out how to do more of that, because that's really the very definition of success, right? It's the ability to repeat it.
Double click on that interaction layer. Talk more about how can leaders become more intentional in exactly what you said, changing that interaction layer.
Yeah. So, one of the big myths is that management has to sort of herd cats, right? You get these individual contributors and you're trying to get them going in the right direction. And it's actually a friend of Tim's, Mike Hatch, who had a much better way of framing a management problem, which is it's more like herding butterflies. And I loved it because as soon as you get that picture of the monarchs in your mind, you realize no one tells them where to go, but they go where they need to be. They go when the conditions allow them to flourish. So it's whether or not the soil has been watered and nurtured. It's whether or not you've planted enough variety of things that allow them to come and get fed. It's whether or not there's sunshine and so on, right? And so I think management role is less about creating the sort of directional, like you must do this, and sort of breaking big tasks into small tasks, which is what the industrial era was about. In an ideas economy, it's saying, hey, how do I create the conditions by which people come, and then more importantly, come together? And as they come together to create, how do I set it up, the scenario, so that they're rewarded to focus on the play and not the player, the work and not the politics, so that we can actually get really interesting things done, because that's ultimately why we all started the firms we started and why we even joined teams in the first place.
In a lot of organizations, you and I have seen any kind of real innovation, any kind of lasting change, any kind of transformational work is as much cultural as anything. And a lot of leaders want to be intentional about the cultures they build. You argue the culture is what you inherit. So talk a little about how do I create, in that butterfly example, how do I create the environment where I attract more people that know where they need to be and know what needs to get done? And you're also going to chuckle at this. I talk about a lot of leaders have a hard time disengaging because they hire projects and not peers.
Yeah.
They hire people that need to be babysat. They hire people that need to constantly be told what to do versus those that are problem solvers, they're systems thinkers, they know what needs to get done, and they take initiative and they have intellectual curiosity and they go tackle the really important things. So talk about designing a culture like that, that the butterfly environment that attracts the right kinds of butterflies you want to build with.
Yeah. So first, I remember Rita McGrath and I were on some Thinkers 50 community thing where we were, because both of us are on the rank list and stuff, and we were in some, I don't know, digital interaction. It was sometime during COVID. And somebody asked about the difference between strategy and execution. I said, actually, I think that's a false premise. And I said, I'd like to just think about it as this, which is if you can point to a direction of where we're going, a sort of general horizon, right? 95 degrees west, kind of like some general horizon, then people can be coming from a lot of different places, talking about the butterflies, right? People can be coming from a lot of different places, and they can figure out what's the best mechanism to get there. So it might be in a boat or a plane, and all the different variations of modality of how you get there. And I remember Rita, because we were on this chain, and she said, exactly, if you can point people to horizon, then when they join, they're like, I want to get there too, right? And all of a sudden you're focused on something so much bigger than, can I do this the set of things inside this little case, which is such a confined way of thinking about work. And it's the difference between jobs and work, which is, if I can predefine for you, hey, there's 7 pens in this pencil case, and I need you to alphabetize them, blah, 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 then I predefine the job, right? Yeah. And if I think about what a lot of us do when we write job descriptions, we're sort of doing that. And then we're saying, here's how we're going to measure whether or not that thing is done and whether or not you're successful. And I'm like, what an interesting constraint. Because I actually think it would be so much more fascinating to say, what we're actually looking for is writing something beautiful from these tools that serves an audience of leaders looking for change agents. Can you figure out what the right tools are and make sure we have them in place?
You just profoundly expanded my excitement and my eagerness to jump in and contribute, because again, you're allowing me to think bigger than just how many pens or pencils are in that damn thing.
Right. And I think that's, we have these very old constructs. And one of the lines I wrote in the book, that most of our management principles today aren't necessarily more persuasive. It's just that they're more persistent. And then we haven't gone back and said, is that really serving us to sit there and cut big jobs into little pieces and then assign them out to people and have projects that we're managing then? Or is there another way, given how much talent and information access we have and education have and passions we have, is there another way that we could actually define work? And I think the AI universe might be one of those inflection points where we have a chance to do some redesign.
Talking about probably one of the most hated management persistence, performance reviews. Nobody likes doing them. Nobody likes giving them or getting them, despite overwhelming evidence. Why do you believe it's like one of those organizational anchors, right? Why do you believe they persist?
Well, I tell the story in the book about, I had gone to some leadership seminar and raised my hand and basically said, hey, listen, I like it when people judge me. I like it when people tell me if I'm on track. I like it when I get criticism. And I remember the moment, because when I said it, the rest of the room laughed. And I was like, what am I missing that they're hearing and I'm not? And because to me, when I was in relational, any kind of relational construct, so a personal relationship and someone says, hey, this isn't working for me, I kind of think about it as, oh, if I fix that, then I can be, in relationship with you. And at work, it tells me whether or not my boss likes me enough for me to have my job. And if it's tied to promotions, if you tell me what it is I need to do to get the next promotion, right? Like, these are all ways in which I can therefore stay in alignment with people. And the room had left, and then the professor had come in and said, what you're assuming is that you wouldn't naturally do these things that you actually want to do to create value and stuff. You wouldn't just do them because you want to. You're assuming you need to be criticized on the way there. And I was like, that's not really true. And now that so many years later, I've been unpacking that conversation. It's true, right? Like, a horse doesn't need to get flogged to want to. If they're a great horse, they want to run, right? And dogs want to chase squirrels. Like, there's just something so innate to every creature that you don't need to beat them to make them, do it. And for, I think, us humans, we want to create and we want to come together with other people to do great work. That's not a mystery. I've never met a person who doesn't. The guy who's like shaking cans at Benjamin Moore wants to be able to do something meaningful. And the fact that he's been defined a very specific job that is about measure the thing and the thing, that's not his fault, right? That he's not allowed to add his bit. And so we need to just kind of think about how much we've been taught that judgment is a good thing, and that we need to be judged by outside people in order to know whether or not we're doing a good thing. And if you and I, yeah. Oh,
yeah.
please.
No, I was going to say for our audience, if you just joined us, you're listening to Niloufar Merchant, Thinkers 50 friend, her new book, Our Best Work, Break Free from 24 Invisible Norms That Limit Us. I can't recommend her or her insights enough. Go grab a copy. And I think you're going to really be challenged, I think, in some of your assumptions and your assertions about what really works in building, creating, sustaining, and amplifying real value. I want to talk about the intangible value. A lot of what you're talking about, I'm not convinced show up on a financial statement. So why is intangible value still so strategically kind of misunderstood?
Yeah, you and I have been working on this problem for a long time, which is we can measure capital-based things, and in the S&P 500 right now, we can track, I think it's something like 14%, no, 16% of the market value. So if we look at a stock, we can actually trace only 16% of it and tie it back to buildings and employee costs and IP patents and so on. The rest of it is all considered intangible and invisible to the market valuation. And the reason is it's all the ways in which we're building an ideas economy, which is not about what you bring necessarily all by yourself or I bring all by myself, but how those two end up being joined together to solve meaningful problems. That's invisible. So we don't know how well people are collaborating. We don't know if we're leaning on each other. We don't know if we're able to have difficult conversations, therefore allowing us to challenge our own earlier thinking and build the next thing. And so when we started identifying the intangibles, we're like, that was one example, right? Are we comfortable having uncomfortable conversations? And then the second one was, do we blame the people bringing us challenges, or do we actually look at the problem they're bringing us? So do we demonize the person or look at the data? And the third one is, do we understand that some of the ways in which we've been thinking about values as being independent of value creation is based on old archetypes of Adam Smith saying, all that matters is that you take care of your own self-interest and the rest will take care of itself. And there's a beautiful book, by the way, on the subject by Katrin Marcel, who's a Swedish author. And she said, well, who made Adam Smith's dinner? Her point being all the things that actually create his universe, whether it was the love of the people who tended his children and so on, were skipped from Smith's economic model. And yet it's a foundation that is a norm around us to say it is about value creation first, value distribution next, and values can go at the end of the line. And so we just went and took each of those elements apart and said, what's the intangible assumption? How does that shape our behavioral norms? And then how do we actually put it down as a limiting norm and adopt a practice that is much more suited for modern work?
Talking about norms, when I wrote Co-Create, one of the biggest
great book title, by the way. That's a book title. Good job, David.
But I thought this was really interesting as I was reading yours. Niloufar, the biggest pushback to this idea of none of us have the market cornered, we all bring unique perspectives, and two or more parties can truly co-create net new value. The biggest pushback came back to, okay, who owns it? Who gets credit for it? Who controls it? I mean, all these things that I think are ingrained in us. My question of you is, how should leaders rethink about those attributes that are still heavily driven into, they're in the MBA and even executive MBA programs. So you're trying to, I think I am as well, trying to change their lens, change the perspective of rethink about that. How do you think they should think about, again, specifically ownership, who gets credit for it, who controls where it goes and how it gets to the market? Talk about that for a second.
Sure. In fact, if I can, I'm going to share a little story. So I had written this piece for Harvard Business Review's on their front cover, which in the magazine world is kind of a big deal that it made to the front cover. And it was a piece, and the title was how TED lost control of its brand, or something like that. The word control was in the headline. And I didn't pick the headline, but I had written this whole piece about what had happened, which is someone in TEDx Valencia, I want to say, had run an event that was much more pseudoscience than science, the healing power of crystals and so on and so on, like some stuff that was a little, more woo-woo, but really packed it up as hard science. And a lot of people online were making fun of it and sort of saying, TED lost control of the quality of its talks by doing TEDx. Now, the instinct at corporate, and with Chris and others, was sort of to be like, oh, well, we should shut things down. And there was another countervailing instinct inside the same organization to say, we should learn from this. And that group ended up doing a thing where they said, hey, so they went online, and I happened to tag the person's name. So this is how I actually watched it across the internet. So every time they posted, I saw it. And so they went around the internet and all the little chat groups and said, okay, if we are going to learn from this, what would we need to learn differently? And then somebody chimed in and said, there's a really good set of lists for what differentiates science from pseudoscience. You might want to look at that list. And someone said, and literally it became, and because I was tagging this person, which makes me sound like a stalker, but I was walking, through this process. I was actually watching them do a large co-created conversation. So that this person, it was Emily McManus, by the way. And she basically said, hey, well, if that worked, then what would we do here? And blah, blah, blah. And she was just going through this process. So instead of taking one party out behind the woodshed and saying, dude, you failed us, what they did is they basically said, listen, in the TEDx community, we want to allow as much freedom and agency as possible, because that's where good ideas come from. The new and novel ideas have to come from the edge. Cool. And we have to also know how we're aligned in a way that is meaningful, that allows these talks to have credibility over time. And so what would be the ways in which we would do it so we can actually solve the thing we're trying to do at TED? That instinct, that ability to go from control, and I will take someone out behind the woodshed because they're messing with my brand, to I will let us learn and co-create the rules by which we will actually get better and have community enforced principles, was such a beautiful story. And the reason, obviously, that HBR published it. And I got so much grief from Chris because the word control was, it made it sound like TED lost something. And I'm like, actually, the entire piece is a love letter to how do you create something that is not yours alone, but is co-owned. And then to answer your question about control, they controlled the inner circle of certain things, like what got published on the website, and they managed the standards. And then they had circles of control of what allowed, to be, so that we could have a porous system and people co-creating all in the process, but some standards also, so alignment, were met. And I think that's a beautiful case study. It's still available. So, I still think it's usable as a thing of how do you manage to have so much co-ownership and yet still manage the quality of what you create? How do you move from control to co-creation? And how do you allow trust to be built over time? I mean, those are complex things that we're all dealing with.
And what a fabulous learning and growth opportunity for TED as an organization to really bring in different lenses, different perspectives from different people, and learn how to love that, create alignment.
TED wouldn't be what it is today if June Cohen and other people at that time really sat there and thought, how do we open up the universe? And I really viewed this as a beautiful process of saying, it's not about what any one entity does alone. It's, we used to think about that as the strategy had to be owned by a firm, and then customers were out there and partners were out there. And, my book, Social Era, was about how do you actually stop calling that center and move to the edge of the perimeter of an organization and then call that center, because it's at the interface between customers and partners and what a company can do, that actually all value creation is actually happening.
Love it. If you've joined us late, again, you're listening to Niloufar Merchant. She is the author of the brand new book, Our Best Work. We know each other through the Thinkers 50 community. By the way, if you're in Los Gatos, she knows a fabulous little lunch place. That's a great, very, very, and Los Gatos is just beautiful with all the quaint shops and restaurants. But The Purple Onion was a fantastic little place we met for
Rendezvous
lunch.
point. Yes,
I
yes.
loved it. Break free from 24 invisible norms that limit us. Anything surprise you in your research, or what? I guess what was the biggest surprise for you in this researching this and writing this book?
Oh gosh, a couple things really come to mind, and one of them was okay. One of them was I had written a story. It was a story about someone who had started at a firm and then basically found out that almost everything that firm said in the outside world didn't turn out to be true inside. And so, but they were really struggling with what does that mean and how to react to it and so on. And so that was going to be the basis of a story about trust. And my son happened to be home for the summer, and I had planned on hiring a young person to read it because, I've been at work for a long time, so I wanted to get a fresh set of eyes so that I didn't write really dated things or stupid jokes or whatever. And so I'd already planned on hiring someone about his age. And then he came home for the summer and was looking for a job. And I said, actually, Mama's got a job, actually, and I'd be happy to pay you. And he read this chapter, and again about when do we trust the leaders that we work with? How do we have that relationship? And he kind of did this where he just sort of was like, PU, and I was like, really, have I really missed the mark? And what he was saying was his generation will never trust a boss. His generation is set up to believe with real cynicism or skepticism or realism, depending on, how you kind of approach that question, whether or not any boss or any company is worth having allegiance to. And it was sad for me, that moment of like, oh, I've not nailed that level of frustration, right? That generation's feeling. But it was also a real opportunity for me to go back and rethink what was I thinking and assuming and reimagining, with that lens of we've been disappointed a lot, right? And how do we think about the trust question in that light? And so that was a surprising moment. And I think that the ultimate product of what I produced was so much better because of his little PU kind of moment. Another one was, this is probably a harder one to say out loud, is there's things that we all do at work that like I did with the review where I thought, oh, it's a good thing to be judged. And then you have these realizations of actually what I'm doing is signing up for someone else to tell me if I'm on track. And that's an interesting way of giving away power. Letting someone else decide what is true. And so throughout the process, when I was writing, I just had these moments of my own history where I just went, oh, I've participated in my own oppression.
Yep.
And that is a hard thing to say. It's probably the kindest thing to say at some level because it also says, oh, now that I see it, I can do something about it. But there's just moments in the writing. In fact, a friend who used to be an SVP for one of the big chip companies around here apparently was reading it, and he was texting me and saying, okay, I feel really shameful because a lot of the things that I've read by chapter 3 are things that I thought were good. And now I see are not, let's say, the best leadership. And I go, well, I hope it's not shame. I hope it's learning, right? I hope we can move past the model of I've done it wrong to I can do it better. And I think that's just my own learning process too, of how to write into that space so we can all just learn and grow instead of seeing it as something we failed at in the past.
So talking about doing things better, I was surprised that when I read you with a pretty compelling approach, by the way, you argue that strategy and execution are one and the same. So talk about that and talk about what breaks when organizations artificially, based on some legacy mindset, separate the two.
Yeah. So the story in the book is a bunch of us, I'd been brought in at Adobe to come and look at their education strategy to see if, they could get it back because they were losing their core early designers out of school to, at that time, Macromedia. And I had this, set of, experiences. I had run different education programs up to that point. At Autodesk, I had helped at Apple, et cetera. So I had and I ran the $50 million division of education stuff at Autodesk. So I was like, have some takes, have some, knowledge. And I brought in people across all the Adobe education teams and so on, and we were working on what could we be doing. And it was really iterative of like, if we could fix the product in some way, would that make a difference? If we could change the price point and licensing, could that make a difference? Right. So, and one of those is like talking to salespeople leads you to have a conversation with the product team, which leads you to have a conversation with the customer. And you're just pulling on all the multiple threads, and people are tugging on it and so on. And we were arriving at a plan that ultimately, by the way, caused Macromedia to fold and get bought by Adobe. So we were incredibly successful. And in the middle of this, planning process, which at this point was probably like 200 people big, Bruce Chizen, who was then the CEO at the time, right before Shantanu, ended up handing out a book called Execution. And I'd heard of the book, but hadn't read it yet. And so
Larry Bossidy, right?
Yes. And so, and there's benefit to the book. So but I'm going to tell you the negative side of the book for a minute, and then I'll come back to the positive if we need to. But he was basically handing this out. And then within the first couple of pages, and I'm like, well, if the CEO is handing out this book, I have to pay more attention to it and really make sure I understand why he cares about it. And basically says, listen, execution's everything, and proceeds to lay out in 4 bullet points what to do if execution's not going well. And what it amounted to was somebody's deciding and everyone else is executing. In our lived experience, what we were just sitting here doing with 200 people big and actually really figuring something out was figuring out, okay, if we went here, what would be the executable part? And then if we executed that way, what would happen to the strategy? And these are an interplay. They are not just a top-down edict. And so I had this insight that what was happening then was Bruce saying to all his people, if we fail, it's because we're not executing well. And I'm like, actually, every person in this organization is executing beautifully. So that's not the gap. The gap is a gap between the top thinking they know what they need and the bottom knowing a bunch of things that, other people in the organization don't know yet. And in the middle is an air sandwich, which is the missing information. And it just, good peanut butter and jelly sandwich has to have peanut butter. Inside our organizations, we're basically having this air sandwich, which is we're missing all the trade-offs and discussions and debates that lets us have thinking together, that lets us actually connect the detail, operational execution on the ground insight to, we need to go here. And so I said, by thinking about these as really 2 separate things, we were allowing vacuums of information inside the business, which is really the vacuum of co-thinking, co-creating stuff together. And that feels like the real opportunity to grow, because I've never, what's funny is I'll say this really emphatically, and sometimes people push back. And then when I ask them to play with it for a minute, it turns out to be true. But I've never met a team fail because so-and-so doesn't do their job. I've only met teams that fail because the gap between the jobs, something just falls right between that crevice. And then everyone kind of looks down and kind of like watches it fall and goes, oh, what should we do now? Kind of thing, right?
Or who owned that one?
Exactly. Exactly. And so I'm like, well, let's stop thinking about it then with these gaps between us. Let's actually think in a more integrated way. And then we will hand off to each other and run a different kind of game because we're going to use everyone's strengths, on the team.
With another conversation, somebody described the interconnectivity between strategy and execution as a lattice. Right? You make a move, you learn, you make another move, you learn, you apply, you learn something new, right? So this idea that highly intertwined goes dramatically further in and as you said, closing those gaps between the jobs to be done. Switch gears for a second to AI. You and I live in the middle of this. I think for our audience, a day doesn't go by when you're hearing, seeing, piloting, doing something around this, particularly in routine, mundane work, where it is aggressively replacing, and nobody wants to talk about this, but displacing a lot of roles, displacing a lot of what traditionally people have done. What uniquely human contributions do you believe become that much more valuable where do people contribute moving forward that, ChatGPT can't finish building that building for me, but within the organization, what else can I be doing? What else should I be doing to really amplify the value that I create?
Yeah, when I'm fascinated, I was just talking to my investment portfolio team, and I said, I hope AI replaces a bunch of jobs that are stupid and that are asking people to do routine things. I'm not discounting the fact that there's an economic issue that needs to be addressed, but those people were not satisfied in their jobs. Those jobs were cookie cutter, like do this, do the counting of the pens and the thing. Like that is a stupid job. So I hope it does it. But what we're conflating are three things. So there's such a thing as information, which is separate from insight, which is separate from intelligence. And I think AI is unbelievably good at doing that data gathering, data synthesis, data inference. And so, okay, information is now more broadly accessible and can do routine things better. Cool. It cannot do the deductive insight, inductive, insight that says, hey, David, if you were building for X, what about thinking about Y? Right? And sitting there and going, what could we do that would be blue sky that would let us actually solve a new problem? Like that process of insight is so distinct to each of us. And based on that point of view, only one brings, right? I'm going to see something different in the universe and you're going to see it's going to be different than the next person. And we bring these multivariant sort of points of view together to form insights. Then there's intelligence, which is not the thing any of us do sitting by ourselves. It's to go, oh, if we're going to solve the climate change crisis, then what are multivariant things that could be brought together? It reminds me of when IBM wanted to enter the green space. Excuse me. IBM wanted to enter the green space, and this was literally when it was called the green space. Like they didn't know what the hell it was, and they didn't know what value they could offer. They didn't know where they should do their product offers. Nothing. They literally knew nothing. And instead of sitting in that space of we should know more, what they did was they actually said, let's go to the edge of our universe and stop thinking about the institution as being the center. Let's go to actually where all the partnerships and customers and problem solving happens. Let's bring people together. And so they did a consortium. And then they said, talk amongst yourselves about what problems need to be solved. And we're going to sit and listen and we're going to have perspective. But what we're looking for is what are really complex problems where IBM could have some value add. But in the meantime, we're happy that you guys can all learn from each other. And so they did basically like a, classic like network mapping of here's the problems and here's places that are really unsolved solution areas and stuff. And in that process, IBM was able to actually figure out a place they could add value that served that community. They showed up without knowing any of the answers. And I want to say, because I wrote about it in Social Era, I want to say it was a 7% top line growth to the company based on something they couldn't see at all going into it. And I'm like, that's what we need to be able to, that's intelligence creation. That is beyond what David and I would come together. That is when we solve really big problems. And that's not going to be a ChatGPT problem. That's going to be all of us figuring out how to work better together in a relational way.
Love it. Love you. You're speaking my love language. I want you to know that. It's fantastic.
What's the thing? It's like little hearts.
Yeah, you had me at hello. So 2 final questions. And again, for our audience, if you just joined us, Niloufar Merchant, new book, Our Best Work, Break Free from the 24 Invisible Norms That Limit Us. One of the things you said at our lunch that really resonated with me was, this is almost like a new operating system. This is a new, what you've written about, what you're thinking about, what you've captured in this book is a new way of thinking. Talk more about that. Then I want to talk about a CEO client that's either, watching this today and wants to dismantle just one of there's so many nuggets in here, but if I just wanted to dismantle one of the invisible norms, where do I start?
Well, so yes, it is a brand new OS. And in fact, when I was up at Microsoft, Microsoft invited me to come give a book talk first week of release, which was really great of them. And John Maeda, who used to run RISD and is now the vice president of Microsoft, of AI at Microsoft, asked me a really interesting question. And he said, you know, you're an LLM, right? So you're a language learning model, a large learning model. And he goes, what's in 2 words your underlying design principle? And I was just like, oh my God, could you ask me a harder question? You know, kind of thing. It's like, geez, on the spot. But I asked him it for a second, and then I thought about it, and I said, well, if we engineer and design for human aliveness, we can have a new OS, because what we've been designing for is really a legacy of the industrial era, which is about productivity and performance and efficiency. And those design principles were absolutely right for the industrial era.
Mm.
But in an ideas economy, and especially given the tools capabilities we have now, what are we designing for? And I'm picturing in my head this Star Trek universe that I was raised on, which is each person got to use their gifts, right? The guy without limited vision could do things with his little tools, and the person who was an empath got a thing to use their, and so on and so on. And that the unnecessary things that needed to happen were done in a different way. It was about how people came together to do discovery and problem solving and creativity. And I think that's really the ingenuity I hope that we tap into. And no one has addressed it as systemically as I have through, like the interrelatedness of it. So I think that means it's more complex, but also we're trying to solve a really complex problem. So I hope that I meet the complexity where it needs to be met, so that we can actually make work for all of us.
Love it. So where do I start? Where does the CEO that wants to dismantle one start?
Yeah, so one of the things I just did, and it'll be alive really soon, is built a research instrument that will let you actually go through and say, where is my team weakest? Or you could just call it your biggest opportunity, whichever way you want to market it to yourself. Identify sort of that, and then go, okay, if I fix that, what is the upside? So if I fix my access to new and novel ideas, the data says that you have between 2 to 4% uplift year over year, independent of any other variable, if you do a certain set of things. And then we identify a specific intervention. And the idea is start making some forward motion, just start swimming in the direction that we want to go, and we will figure this stuff out together. And I think it's going to be in the practice of living into these new norms, the new norms that we need to create, new metrics we need to create, so that we can actually build the organizations we so need.
I love it. For our audience, Niloufar Merchant is author of this brand new book, Our Best Work, Break Free from 24 Invisible Norms That Limit Us. Niloufar, where can people learn more about you? Or what's the best place to learn more about you, your efforts, the book?
Yeah, I'm everywhere online at Nilofer, Nilofer, sort of like Oprah, Nilofer. And the Intangible Labs work will probably be announced in the next few weeks. So if anybody wants to sign up, just sign up. I'll announce it across every platform to make sure people have access to it.
I love it. Well, thank you for making the time. Thanks. It's always great to see you. Thanks for the insights in the book. I appreciate the early copy and a chance to, read through it early. And our lunch visit is always lovely. For our audience, I love doing these. I don't know about you. I learned something new from every single one of them. I got a chance to reconnect and introduce my friends to a broader audience, and they're just great conversations. Join us for the next one. Another good friend, Mark Roberge, has written a book called The Science of Scaling. So I'm scheduling that with Mark. I heard him speak in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago. First Chief Revenue Officer at HubSpot. So Mark has got likewise some really interesting insights in how to be more intentional about how you think about scaling an idea, scaling a concept. Niloufar, thanks for joining us. For our audience, we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.